Hey guys, this is John, and I'm on chesstempo.com about to solve some tactics. It's been a little while since I've done a tactics training video, but I figured let's get a new one out there. And instead of using Lead Chess, I'm going to use Chess Tempo today. Chess Tempo is a free site, and it's one of the best servers for solving online. And the thing I really like about Chess Tempo is that the clock, the timer that tells you how much time you've used on a problem, is off to the side and not in like your field of vision when you're solving. In the past, in my tactics videos, I've extolled the virtues of solving for accuracy rather than speed, and not really worrying like what your tactics training rating is, and instead worrying about getting the problems right because that's what's going to help you over the board. And it seems to me like Chess Tempo has the right message for that. So I'm going to solve some problems. I created a new account to do this. I've only done one problem, which is the problem that you see that I just completed. And I'll talk through my thought process as we go. So let's go ahead and go to the next problem. So this one's white to move. Black has just played b4, attacking the queen on c3. First thing I notice is that there are multiple pieces hanging. Black's queen on c5 is undefended, so white could play bishop takes c5. And there's also the bishop on g7 that is undefended. So bishop takes g7 may be a factor to consider. However, taking the bishop on g7 immediately would probably not be high on our list of moves to look at because it would lose the queen on c3. What else to note? We want to look at the material. So material-wise, it is equal. We have the same number of pawns and pieces. It looks like with b4, if we try to understand the opponent's last move, and I like that tactics training sites give you that last move, it looks like black is trying to deflect one of white's pieces. So let's say hypothetically white were to take the pawn on b4 with the queen. So queen takes b4 right now. Black could take on b4. And then after knight takes b4, bishop takes d4 check, wins the bishop, and that would also fork the king and the rook. So that doesn't look so good for white to me. So the first moves we'd want to look at would be moves like moving the queen, maybe taking the queen on c5. That's a forcing move. It's a capture. So forcing moves are checks, captures, and threats, just to remind you. And along those same lines, knight e7 check would be a move to look at because that attacks the king. Let's look at knight e7 check first, because if knight e7 check, I notice that black cannot play king h8 because of bishop takes g7 mate. Or yeah, bishop takes g7 would be mate. So on knight e7 check, king f7 would be forced. And maybe that changes the position somehow. I don't see any follow-up checks that white has. The queen would still be under attack. Yeah, I don't know about that. I think that still has problems white needs to solve. So I'll put knight e7 on the back burner for now. It doesn't look like it's going to pan out. What about bishop takes c5? So bishop takes c5 would run into a capture on c3, and probably black would take with the bishop, if I had to guess, because that would attack the rook on a1. And then white would have two pieces under attack, that rook on a1 and also the bishop on c5. So that doesn't look appetizing either. If bishop takes g7, black's just taking the queen, and I don't see an effective follow-up. So we've got maybe a mildly tough one on our hands. Now that we've looked at all the forcing moves, let's look at non-forcing moves, so moves that aren't checks, captures, those sort of things. You want to look at major threats as well. And I noticed that one move in particular would solve the problem of our queen being under attack and also create a major threat. And you might have seen that move by now. By the way, if you don't want to hear me talking about these problems, I definitely recommend pausing the video at the beginning of each problem so you can work them out for yourself. But the move I'm thinking about is queen to g3. So that gets the queen out of attack. We're pinning the bishop on g7. So black would be unable to play bishop takes d4 then. That would be illegal. And the thing I really like about that is it's a double attack because we're attacking the queen on c5 now that we get our queen out of danger. And we're also threatening mate on g7. So the bishop and the queen would be combining for that checkmate. So I believe that's the solution. Note that if black were to play queen takes d4 check at that point, we have our knight that could take. And black wouldn't even be able to take with the bishop, so we'd just be winning their queen for a minor piece. And that's about all the further I would look in my calculations. I would make sure I'm not missing anything obvious that black could do. But as far as I can tell, black's losing their queen or getting checkmated after queen g3. So let's play it and see. Black takes on d4 and we take back, and we got the problem correct. So that method I used to solve this problem is a textbook example of how you want to solve a tactical problem. We looked at our forcing moves first, if we go back in the sequence. So I looked at moves like knight e7 check, which I didn't like because of king f7. And I also looked at queen takes b4. What if we just take the pawn, get rid of the attack on the queen, but we didn't like that because of this. And then bishop takes d4 with the fork on the king and also the rook here. So once we've looked at our forcing moves, and maybe even bishop takes g7 too, then you got to look at the non-forcing moves, the moves that are not checks and captures. And queen g3 just fit the bill. That created major threats. After your checks and your captures, major threats like mate, setting up a checkmate in one, those are good moves to look at too. Okay, so let's go to the next problem. In this one, we are black. White has played queen f8. And looking at the material, it is even once again. It's okay if you have to spend a little bit of extra time counting the material yourself. I'm just very used to scanning the board and being able to take in the material on the fly. But don't feel like if you can't do that, that's a very bad thing. That's common. You need practice at that as in chess. So queen f8 attacks the rook on d6. I noticed that there's some king safety issues, mainly for white. Black's king also is a little exposed, and when the opponent's queen is close to your king, you're always going to be a little bit worried about that. So that's one thing I'm looking at immediately after examining the material. I do notice that if we're going to look at checks here, black has a couple checks to consider, namely queen d4 check and also queen e1 check. Of course, moves like queen e4 or queen takes f4 or queen d2 are also possible, but I would just mentally discard them because it appears to me black's going to lose the queen on each of those. But queen d4 check and queen e1 are moves I would prioritize because they do check and force white to make a decision with the king. So let's take queen e1. Queen e1 is decent looking because we get to penetrate behind enemy lines. White can block either with rook e2 or they can play king f3 and run. Probably they would play king f3 because that gives white a discovery on our queen on e1 with their rook. So that's possible, but I don't see that leading anywhere at the moment. After queen e1 check, king f3, maybe we'd want to continue the variation like queen d1 check or queen h1 check. But let's say queen d1 check. If white were to play king g2, we would have queen h1 mate, but they don't have to play king to g2. They could block with a rook. They can maybe even play the king back to e3. So I guess I'm not seeing much after queen e1, king f3. It'd be nice to include our rooks in the attack somehow. I don't know that the queen alone is going to scare white too much. So let's look at queen d4 check as well. So queen d4 check, white can move the king to f3, e2, or d2. d2 would just drop the rook on f2 with check, though, so I don't think they'd want to play that. If king e2, again, I don't see much of a follow-up. Our queen looks nice on d4. It's centralized, and it guards d6, but is there a follow-up? I don't really see one. So queen d4 also not looking incredibly promising to my eyes. What else? So we've looked at two obvious checks. There's sacrificial stuff like rook takes d3 check. You might lump that in the same category as some of the nonsensical queen checks at the beginning, although it's probably potentially better than that. There is kind of an alignment issue here between the queens. Like white's queen on f8 is on the same diagonal as black's queen. So this is just a hypothetical variation, but say we played rook takes d3 check, and white were to take with the king, well, that would lose the white queen due to c4 check, and the black queen would be peering at the f8 square, and we just pick up the queen after white gets out of check. So this is sometimes how tactical ideas just come to mind. It's not like there's some process whereby I would find that idea. It's just kind of like noticing some aspect of the position, like an alignment issue, that might cause me to look for tactical motifs along those lines. So, I mean, that's a potential start. Rook takes d3 check. White would have to take with the pawn, I believe. And then there's no c4, because c4 is not coming with check. So I was excited about rook takes d3, but if I can't find anything after c takes d3, I'll have to give up that line. There's the same set of checks available, but I don't really see those leading to anything. So rook takes d3 isn't working. Queen d4 and queen e1 I wasn't so enthusiastic about. Probably I should look at queen e1 a little bit more, because queen e1 is pretty forcing. Rook e2 would be met by queen takes g3 check, which I believe is good for black. So queen e1 check, king f3. What about that line again? Queen h1 check, king back to, let's say, e2. Don't see much there. Yeah, just not much going on. Can I ever get this rook involved? Probably not, unless I can figure out some way to save this rook in the process or sacrifice it favorably. Could I play rook h3, attack the g3 pawn? If rook h3, queen takes d6, rook takes g3 check. If rook f3, queen e1 would be mate. So after rook takes g3 check, white would have to play king e2. But do I have a follow-up there? There also, I don't really see a follow-up. There's no obvious check that's going to hurt white. Okay, so now I'm going to try to build off that idea with rook takes d3 check. What if I play pawn c4? One thing I mentioned in another video I just recorded, actually, is the importance of changing up your move order. Like when you see a good idea, don't just immediately play the idea or just only analyze that one line. You want to try to mix up your move order a little bit and try to make it better. So I was talking about this alignment issue between the queens. If rook takes d3 doesn't work right away, having in mind the c4 idea, what if I play c4 first? Because that does two things. One, it opens up the queen to defend the rook, and it also threatens rook takes d3 check with the discovery on the queen. So that might be the missing puzzle piece that we need. And if I saw this move in a game, I would start getting excited right about now. So that's why I'm really looking at c4 pretty hard. And it's going to disturb white's king. Like if c4, say they play pawn d4, trying to stop rook takes d3. I mean, at the very least, I have queen c3 check, which looks tremendous for black. White's king is open. And on c4, any of the captures are just going to lose the queen to rook d3 check. White could maybe move their queen away somewhere, but I don't see like a great square, and I'm able to take on d3 next move. So I think that's enough for me to go for this. I already spent a little bit of time on this one, and I feel pretty good about it. So let's go c4. Yep, and that appeared to be the right move. We pick up this queen. All right, so we get that problem correct. Yeah, nice one. Good example of alignment and the issues associated with aligned pieces, particularly heavy pieces. Heavy pieces are rooks and queens, and sometimes you can set up attacks against heavy pieces using alignment issues, because rooks and queens are long-range pieces, and you notice I'm using one of my long-range pieces to target one of white's long-range pieces here. Queen on queen. Yeah, and b takes c4 should not be played since that loses the queen, but I don't know if white has another reasonable move. It kind of looks like their position's collapsing after c4. Nice little move right there. All right, let's go to the next one. Once again, we're playing black. White has just played b4. So material, looks like black is down material in this one. Nope, I correct that because black has a bishop. Black has a rook, a knight and a bishop against white's lone knight, and all the other pieces cancel each other out. White does have, what, 2 extra pawns? So white has 2 pawns for the piece, but black is ahead 1 point. That said, white has some pretty intimidating pieces, like his rooks are centralized on good files. This queen and knight are operating together pretty efficiently, it seems to me. Potential king safety problems for both players. Maybe for white on the back rank, and also for black on the back rank. Whenever there's a queen knight present, in close proximity to each other, you always have to be aware of the attacking potential of such a unit, because queen and knight just work so well together. They don't reproduce any of each other's squares, so they can really combine for a lot of damage. Unlike a queen and a bishop, which are going to overlap to some degree. Okay, so b4. I don't know why white would play b4 on the previous move. That seems bizarre to me. Like b5 is not a threat. Black has a pawn there. So I'm struggling to understand white's last move. One thing that last move might tell us is that white doesn't have any obvious and direct threats. Like, if white's pawn was on b2 in the previous position and it was their move, there wasn't anything, apparently, that they came up with that was devastating. So maybe black has a moment for a breather here. So looking at forcing moves, rook takes e1 check is obviously forcing. White would reply with rook takes e1. And then that's one less piece defending the knight on d5, but can I use that to my advantage? I don't know. One thing I don't necessarily like about rook takes e1 is that after rook takes e1, rook takes e1, white would be threatening queen takes b8 check, knight takes b8, and then rook e8 checkmate. So that makes me a little skeptical of that continuation. A move like queen takes d5 would be cool, but totally unsound at the moment. I'd be trying to deflect the rook from d1, but white could always take with their queen, or maybe even insert a capture on e8 first. Queen takes g3 is pretty crazy. Don't ever see that working. So the checks and the captures are not leading us anywhere here. I think we'd love to get this bishop involved. It's kind of buried on b7, but that is the piece that black is ahead right now. And if you notice white's pawns, particularly on the king side, they're kind of they're all on dark squares, so he's weakened his light squares a bit, specifically that f3 square. Like if we could land a knight in there, that would be a fork on the king and the rook. So I'm looking at knight e5, trying to go knight f3 check. I think that's one move I would be sorely tempted to make in a real game. Maybe even knight d4, trying to prove that this rook is overloaded. Knight d4, and if rook takes d4, we have rook takes e1 check. So let's look at those two moves, knight e5 and knight d4. If knight d4, I might as well continue going with that one. What if rook takes e8 check, rook takes e8, and then rook takes d4? That abandons the back rank, but can I do anything with that? I can give a check on e1, white's king comes up to g2. I still have back rank issues myself. See, if I were black, I'd feel more comfortable if like my pawn was on h6, so I always knew I could escape with my king if necessary to h7. But I probably just don't have time to do that right here. Well, maybe I do, but that's not going to be the answer to the tactic. So knight d4 I'm not liking because of rook takes e8. So what if knight e5? The knight is better defended on that square, and we're threatening knight f3. It's possible that could be the solution, but like what if f4, forking the queen and the knight? Then if knight f3 check, king f2, both the queen and the knight would be under attack. Maybe queen h5 then. Looks a little unclear to me. Possibly in black's favor, but I have a hard time assessing that position. So knight e5 is a maybe. I'm lukewarm on that move. I don't see a refutation of it, but I also don't see it killing white either. There's something like rook e6 attacking the white queen. This rook is defended by the knight in addition to the other rook, so if we move this rook up to e6, that wouldn't hurt us much. So rook e6, let's say rook takes e6, d takes e6, hitting the knight. Queen takes e6. Maybe rook d8 then, trying to use the d-file pin on the knight. Again, I kind of feel the same way about knight e5 as I do about rook e6. It's somewhat tempting, but I don't see it crushing white. Sometimes in solving these tactics, you have to have a flexible mindset. Like the correct move may not necessarily be something that wins a queen or leads to checkmate. It might be like more positional sometimes even, although usually not with these types of tactics trainers. So let's keep searching. Knight e5 and rook e6 are okay, but not amazing. Knight takes b4. Idea, if queen takes b4, I can play bishop takes d5, but knight takes b4, there is knight takes b4 back. And what have I gained for the knight I've just sacrificed? I've gained an open bishop, but unless my queen and bishop could get on this diagonal to like threaten checkmate on g2, I don't see that working. Going back to knight e5, because that's about the most promising thing I've come up with so far. Really don't think it's rook takes e1 check. I think that ties us down too much to the back rank weakness. If rook e6, on rook e6, there's maybe even queen takes d7 as well. That's a move I hadn't considered too closely, but might be possible. So on knight e5, I'm threatening knight f3. So I was looking at that f4 move. And then I was saying knight f3 check, king f2, queen h5. And then I'm attacking e1 and I'm also hitting h2. That severely compromises white's king safety. But I was kind of backing off that for that line because it looked unclear to me. But that might be the solution. And what about knight e5 if they play something like rook e3 just to guard the f3 square? I could play knight c4 then, forking the queen and the rook. Rook takes e8 check, rook takes e8, queen takes d7 perhaps. Got a lot of loose pieces there. My rook on e8 and also my bishop. So knight e5, rook e3. What's my solution to that? Knight g4? If that knight leaves e5 though, d7 is so weak. Chess tempo is a tough site. I'm just gonna say right now, three problems in. These are not simple. I would play knight e5 if I can find a solution to rook e3. Just not finding it. Yeah, knight c4, rook takes e8 check, rook takes e8, queen takes d7. White's light squares are so vulnerable, but so are black's undefended pieces. What am I missing? Okay, here's a new idea. What if rook takes e1 check, rook takes e1, queen d2? So then I'd be attacking the rook on e1. No, but that's going to fail to queen takes b8, which I established earlier. Queen takes b8 check, knight takes b8, and then rook e8 checkmate. And the back rank issue catches up with black. So that's just out of the question. Okay, now I'm back to looking at rook e6. Rook e6, rook takes e6, d takes e6, queen takes e6. We've traded a pair of rooks, but we've lost a pawn. In some ways, I like that because it gets a pair of pieces off the board. Knight e5 could be played then. Still that f4 move, though, bothers me. f4, knight f3, check, king f2, queen h5, just like the last line, with unclear consequences. Hmm. We could play a simplifying continuation like queen to g6, offering a queen trade. I doubt that's the solution. Knight d4, I looked at knight d4 earlier and I rejected it because of rook takes e8 check, rook takes e8, and then rook takes d4, and I wasn't finding a solution there. There's checks on the back rank possible then, but black always will be held in check. Their ambitions will be held in check because of the back rank issues of their own. You know, in the interest of time, I'm going to play rook e6. That's the most promising move I've come up with so far. I want to play knight e5. I just I can't figure out the solution. But if I wasn't doing this video, I think I would spend longer to try to figure this out. Let's give it a shot, though. Problem failed. Knight e5 is the move. I should have gone with my instincts. So knight e5, and it gives the line rook takes e5, queen takes e5, take here. Well, that's self-explanatory. They would never do that, though. They would never just take on e5 voluntarily. So f4 was the line I was concerned about here, correct? f4, and then knight f3 check, king here. I think that was the line that bugged me. But maybe it shouldn't. I mean, I see that there's pieces under attack, the queen and the knight, but queen h5, perhaps, and it just might be the case that h2 is very weak. What if rook takes e8, rook takes e8, something like h4 now? Yeah, but I bet black is just winning here. Okay, so should have gone with knight e5. It happens. What about rook e3? Rook e3 was the other move, now that I remember it. I couldn't figure out... That was the move that actually bothered me more than f4. Like how to counteract rook e3. Maybe black should just be happy with the fact that they've unleashed their bishop and maybe gotten their knight to an active post. But is there something good here? I didn't like the fact that if this knight moves, queen takes d7 is possible. Well, if you have a chess engine on hand and you're watching this video, maybe plug this position in and tell me what's going on after rook e3. I'd be curious. Okay, let's go to the next problem. White to move. Black has played queen e6. How should white respond? So white has two minor pieces against black's rook, but black has two extra pawns. So technically black is ahead 1 point of material. Black's king is kind of open right here. So maybe we can utilize that somehow to our advantage. Is black threatening anything? Doesn't look like it. The knight on d7 is protected by the rook and also the queen backing it up. If this queen were to move from guarding e1, though, it'd be immediate checkmate, queen e1 mate. I see a nifty move right off the bat, and that is knight f8, attacking the queen. So if rook takes d5, then there's knight takes e6 with check. That's pretty cool. So if knight f8, then queen takes d5, there's bishop takes d5, and if they were to take the knight, then we could move our queen, like queen f3, and white would have queen and bishop against two rooks. And with black's open king, I'm certain that should be winning for white. So knight f8 is a move that just pops out to me immediately. There's not a lot of checks or captures here that we'd have to look at. Knight takes c5. Knight takes c5 is along the same lines as knight f8, but knight takes c5 picks up a pawn. So if it came down to those two moves, I'd probably choose that one. There's some cool lines possible, like if knight takes c5, queen e7, so just retreating the attacked queen, or queen c8 for that matter, we could play rook takes d8, rook takes d8, and then queen takes d8. And that gives up the queen temporarily. Black can play queen takes d8 in reply, but knight e6 check would fork the king and the queen. So that looks like it's winning material. So you're kind of going out on a limb with knight takes c5. Like white has multiple pieces under attack, the rook and the knight. But you're judging that black cannot exploit that fact. The other line, which I should mention, is if knight takes c5, b takes c5, then we have rook takes d8. And white will be ahead that bishop at the end of the line. Yeah, because knight takes c5, b takes c5, rook takes d8, queen takes d8. They could play queen c4 check, but we have king g1. And then if queen c1 check, we can block with the bishop. And I believe we're going to escape the checks. Yeah, black doesn't have a good follow-up check. Queen g5 check there would lose the queen to queen takes g5. So I think I'm going to play knight takes c5. Looking at moves that could mess us up, but I don't see them. So let's give it a shot. Yep. Take the queen. Okay, so we get that correct. That one was a lot easier than the last one. Maybe because we got that last one wrong, they threw us a easier problem. So notice what I did with knight f8. Like I saw knight f8. That was the move that came to mind right away. It might even work very similarly to knight takes c5, but I don't want to just get blinders on and focus on knight f8 only. Like maybe there's another way to implement this idea, and there happens to be one, knight takes c5, which also picks up a pawn. Okay, so nice little problem there. And the line I was mentioning, this longer line, was b takes c5. If black were to do that, then we take here. Rook takes, queen takes. You wouldn't want to just stop calculating right here. Black still has moves they can play in reply. Yes, white is up a bishop right now, but you wouldn't want to be surprised by a move like queen c4 check. White's king is pretty exposed. And I had calculated in that line I mentioned that after king g1, queen c1, bishop f1, black cannot play queen g5 because our queen covers that square, so black runs out of checks. I guess they would try to pick off a pawn or something, but white should be winning. Let's go to the next one. So we've solved a few problems. I believe this is problem number 5. Rook g8. So material-wise, we are nearly even. Kind of like that last problem. There's a rook versus 2 minor piece situation going on. So black played rook g8. The rook was here, and instead of taking white's rook, which probably would have allowed some back rank stuff, they're moving their rook to g8. So we could play queen takes g8. That's a check and a capture, so let's look at that. Plus it looks like a fun line. So queen takes g8, king takes g8, rook e8 check, nearly mate. Black would have to block with the bishop. And then let's say, we could take with either rook, but let's say rook e takes f8 check, king g7. We got 2 nice rooks lined up on the back rank, but if we play rook f7 check, black plays queen takes f7, and then rook takes f7 check, king takes f7, and black is winning that endgame. All those fancy captures and sacrifices are losing for white. Black has an extra knight and pawn on this side of the board. So queen takes g8, while attractive, doesn't seem to pan out after king takes rook e8, bishop f8. We could take with the other rook, like rook f takes f8 check then, but king g7, and I think it's more of the same. So the immediate capture there doesn't look good. Another move I would look at right away is rook f7. That hits the queen. That also leaves this rook to potentially come into the 7th rank, or also take this knight should black's queen get too far away. So that's a move I'd want to consider. There's also rook takes a3, but after queen takes a3, I don't think we're winning. Black is pretty solid with their king, bishop, and rook right there. So we got to figure out a way to dislodge one of those or open them up. Rook f7 would be the move I would definitely play in a fast game. So if rook f7, queen a8, what happens? Attacking the queen and still trying to defend the knight on a3. Because then queen takes a8, rook takes a8. We could double up on the 7th rank, rook e to e7, hoping that the bishop moves so we can take that pawn. But there's rook g8 even. I don't see white getting anywhere there. So rook f7, queen a8. Potential dead end. Are there ways to attack this knight another time? If rook takes a3 isn't working, like can we attack the knight with like queen d6 or something? Probably not, because knight c4 could be played in reply. That's not looking good. Let's consider rook f7 again. I'm fixated on that move because it appears correct. I mean, establishing a rook on the 7th rank and also doing it with tempo is usually a good thing. So queen a8. I'd like to play rook takes g7 then, but they could just take our queen in that case. And we're out of material. So rook f7, queen a8. Moving the queen somewhere? But where is the thing? Queen c5, attacking the knight? Knight to c4, maybe bring the other rook into e7. We have a lot of firepower coming down there. But what is the threat exactly? There's no threat for the moment. Okay, so rook f7, queen a8. If queen takes a8, rook takes a8. That's the line I was looking at earlier. Rook e to e7, rook g8. And there's no follow-up. Black is too solid there. Yeah, not seeing rook f7, queen a8 leading to much. Maybe rook b7 then, like blocking the black queen attack on the white queen on d5. But then there's knight c4, rook e7, perhaps. If we could avoid a trade and also create some major threats, I'm all for rook f7. But barring one of those things, I don't know if I can choose that move. Here's an idea. What if queen a2? So bring the queen backwards. A passive-looking move. So queen a2 hits the knight twice. And they can't move that knight because they would lose the queen behind it. So if queen a2, black would probably have to play pawn b4. And then I could just play rook takes b4, and that knight is pinned. Although they could play knight b5, maybe, in that case. Because their queen would be defended. That would be an odd defense. Queen a2, b4, rook takes b4, knight b5. It's kind of a funny one. Their queen is, I mean, at least we've won the b pawn in that case, though. We've kind of liquidated the position a little bit, too. And maybe even the ending after queen takes a7, knight takes a7 is good for white. I can almost play to trap black's knight. Not quite, though, I don't think. So what if queen a2, rook a8? Is there any tactic there involving like rook takes a3, queen takes a3, and then trying to deflect the defense of the queen? It doesn't appear so, because rook f8 check, they can even play queen takes f8. So maybe queen a2 is just failing to rook a8. Although then we could play rook f7, and they couldn't play queen a8. They'd have to come forward with their queen. Okay, now I'm seeing more threats against the bishop. So if queen a2, rook a8, rook f7, let's say queen a4, and then I wonder if I can almost take on g7 in that case. I think I could. Rook takes g7, king takes g7, rook e7 check, and black's king is on the run. Yeah, I think that's going to be close to checkmate. So queen a2. I'm liking that move. Spent about almost 8 minutes on it. Let's give it a shot. Queen a2. Oh, failed. Rook f7 is the move. And then queen d4. Okay, so offering a queen trade, but why not this move? Queen a8. I didn't find a a refutation of that. Because, yeah, I mean, you got to bear in mind, sometimes these tactics trainers, like the inputted solution, is not what a human would play. Sometimes they're what the engine would play, and that's why they input it. The creators of the problem just give the best engine move. But, like, no human would play queen d4, because after queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes a3, white has just won a piece. I mean, a human would keep the queen defending the knight here. So, like, that's why I was stuck on queen a8. I couldn't figure out what to do against that move. What am I missing? So if queen takes a8, rook takes, and just didn't seem to me we had enough. I still think white has play here, but a win? Probably not. So there must be something I'm missing right in this position, but again, off the top of my head, I don't see it. I am solving these at around midnight, so please bear that in mind. Not to make excuses for myself, but all right, onward. Let's do a couple more. So black to move here. White has just captured the knight. All right. Well, this makes me suspicious because usually when there's like an automatic recapture type problem, it's not the automatic recapture. So we have these two captures possible with the pawns, e takes and c takes. And considering that, what did white just last play? They took a knight. Okay, so considering white just took our knight, naturally we'd probably look at just recapturing. But I also see that there's this h4 move that could be played, attacking the white queen. And maybe the idea is to try to force that queen off this diagonal so we can take on d4 with check. So if h4, queen takes h4, there's e takes d4 check. And after white gets out of the check, we can take their knight on e3. Contrast that to if we capture right away, e takes is not even possible right now because of queen takes d6, just winning the queen. And c takes, while potentially giving black a decent position, maybe knight f5 is something we have to be concerned about, but potentially black giving a decent position doesn't look like it's going to win material. The position's too closed. So yeah, I think h4. This is a pretty easy one because there's not too many other moves to consider. There's no like obvious captures beyond the capture on d4 or checks to consider. There's no checks at all to consider. So yeah, I think h4, and wherever the white queen goes, we can play e takes d4 check on the next move. Of course, they're not going to play queen f4. We guard that square. All right, and that appears to be the solution. Yeah, and we can take that knight. Yeah, it's interesting how when you're solving, like some problems will just be a breeze and other ones you'll really struggle with, as you saw in that last problem. I really had a hard time with that one, and this one I found it like instantly. So let's keep going. All right, white to move here. Equal material. Looks like it came from a French. I see a forcing line that I think wins material for white. So candidate moves we would look at would be the captures, like rook takes f6 and also maybe knight takes g6. There's also a fork possibility, g5, attacking the rook and the knight, but black could reply rook takes f4. So the thing that just immediately came to mind for me is rook takes f6, king takes f6, g5 check, forking the king and the knight. And that would compel black to play king takes g5, but then we have knight f3 check. And after the king moves, we can take that knight on h6 with our rook on h1. That's a absolutely forced line, and I don't see anything black can do to get out of that. Yeah, knight takes g6 check, I'm really not going to look at because knight takes g6 check, rook takes, and they're covering that knight. So I believe this is going to be it. I'm going to go take that knight. Okay. Next problem. White has played rook d1. This is a messy position. So black has two bishops, but white has two extra pawns and a rook. We've got a lot of these positions where it's like two minors versus a rook. Pretty unbalanced. So in this one, white's king is open, as is black's, but black has the move. So we could play queen h2 check right now on the king. And then after the king goes to f2 or f1, try to chase it. But the thing I dislike is that we can't play rook f8 after queen h2 check, because that would be unguarded. The queen would not be here to support that. So on queen h2 check, probably king f1 would be played. Although maybe we sneak in bishop a6 check then. That's pretty good for black, actually. So on queen h2 check, probably king f2 has to be played. And if queen g3, white will go right back to g1. So queen h2 check, king f2, bishop g3 check, maybe there's king f3, as weird as that looks. Going forward. And then bishop takes e1. Black's king is pretty open, though. White could start giving checks, like queen f6. I would not want to allow that, I don't think. So I'm actually thinking of playing rook f8 first instead of queen h2, because rook f8 will take away the f2 and the f1 squares from the white king, so we can threaten the queen into h2. And considering that black has everything else under control, like maybe we have time to actually bring up that rook, and I don't see what white does about queen h2. Looks like it's winning. White's going to have to play like queen takes f8 to avoid checkmate. They can't block this diagonal. g3, we just take it. So I feel confident about that. I'm going to play rook f8. So a preparatory move, a quiet move, before coming in queen h2. Yeah, because it's so tempting just to play the check immediately. But unless you have a clear follow-up after king f2, you can't really play the check. Because now your rook will never be able to get over to f8. White's queen is always guarding that. I guess black could maybe repeat the position like queen f4 check, but the point remains. And this line I mentioned I didn't like, because even though we potentially like win material, there's all these checks to consider, and look how bare the black king is. Okay. So maybe I'll make it an even 10 problems. I think this down here, there's one problem I did before the video started, so let's call it, currently we're on 8 problems, so 2 more, including this one. So black to move here. White has just played knight e5 to c6, attacking the rook. So material-wise, black is up a pawn. This knight is very annoying. We can take on f1. And if we take on f1, we're doing it with tempo on the queen. And this knight is under attack as well, so what could be more natural than taking the rook and no longer having to worry about the knight? So that's a capture. Also, rook takes f1 is with check. It's a forcing move we'd have to consider. But if rook takes f1, bishop takes f1, that knight on g3 is still under attack. So knight takes f1. Note that they can't play queen e6 then check, because our knight on c5 covers that square. So I assume the idea is if knight takes f1, white's going to play knight e7 check. Is that the scary thing going on? Because then if the king goes to g7 or h8, white can check on d4 with the queen. And maybe black has issues there. But I can block with my rook, can't I? So knight takes f1, knight e7 check, king, let's say to g7, queen d4 check, and just rook f6. And I think we're going to be okay there, because if they recapture on f1, their knight is hanging on e7. So that's kind of an accurate defensive sequence to win material, but it looks like it works. Knight e7 is a little unpleasant. Like, if I were black, I'd prefer to disallow that possibility, but if it doesn't work out and we can still win the rook, maybe we just go for it. I don't see too many other decent options. I mean, we could play knight f5 and withdraw it, but knight takes f1, knight e7 check, king g7. The rook takes f1 seems slow, so I don't think that's going to bother us. So queen d4 check, rook f6. And if they take f1, we take e7. Looks good to me. Let's try. Okay, so king g7. Now we block here. And that was correct. So that was more of a defensive type problem than anything else. Yeah, and if we had continued this line, rook takes f1, trying to exploit the pin here, but that fails to this. Okay, and this will be our last problem for the session. Rook h6. So Material-wise, black is up a pawn. There's some threatening stuff around black's king. I guess white is threatening rook takes f6, king takes f6, followed by queen h6 check, bringing the queen in to harass our king. If we move the knight, rook takes h7 check will be played. So that doesn't look good. We have a deflection possibility, I see right away. So note that the white queen is needed to defend the rook. This is kind of an unusual arrangement, like a queen backing up a rook like that with a pretty closed position going on. Like you kind of wonder how the white rook got to h4 in the first place. But nevertheless, we have this position. So since this queen on h3 is needed to defend the rook, what if I try to distract the queen? One way I could do that is with knight takes g4, but we just established that if we move the knight, rook takes h7 check will be played. So I don't like that possibility. But we can use this rook and play rook takes c3, which is a forcing move. It's a capture. And after queen takes, then we take the rook on h6. And we've got rid of that threatening rook around our king, and we've won a pawn in the process too. The knight would be undefended then, but I don't see what white can do to hurt us there. There's also the line rook takes c3, and then maybe white would do a desperado, meaning they give up material because they know they're going to lose the rook anyways. So maybe they would play like rook takes h7 check, knight takes h7, and then queen takes c3. But given that black was up a pawn to begin with, I think black would be completely fine with that continuation. You know, another move that's pretty tempting too is queen e4, attacking the pawn on g4. If queen e4, rook takes f6, king takes f6, the point is that after queen h6, we can now block with our queen on g6. And we don't even have to get our hands dirty. So queen e4 is also looking pretty good to me. If queen e4, f3, what happens? Attacking the queen. Queen e3 check. King, let's say h1 maybe. Somehow I feel white's attack should not work out. But rook takes c3 looks so clean, I want to play that move. I think rook takes c3 is just going to kill white's attack entirely. Queen e4 is like kind of, I don't want to say greedy, but it's trying to maximize black's gains. Because this is sort of an awkward piece, like there's no doubt about that. The rook, while it's threatening rook takes f6, is pretty strangely placed on that square. So queen e4, f3, what to do then? Queen e3 check, king h1. Could always play queen f4. That rook is kind of stuck there, isn't it? If we play queen f4. It's actually just like amazingly trapped on that square. They could play bishop c2 and maybe threaten h7 in a weird way. There's always rook h8 to defend against that, though. If I had little time on the clock, I think I would play rook takes c3 because that looks more clear-cut. But my instincts tell me queen e4 is stronger. Let's go with queen e4. All right, that was correct, actually. Yeah, and the thing is, white's attack is not going to work out in this line, because after queen h6, there's queen g6 blocking. Whereas before, if there's no block, then white's attack might succeed, because black's king would have to go for a walk, like king e7, queen takes g5 check, etc. Okay, well, I'm glad I had the wherewithal to rein in my instincts on this one and not play rook takes c3. So yeah, queen e4. I mean, I think objectively best for white would be f3, because that attacks the queen and defends g4, but even playing like queen f4 directly here looks like it pretty much paralyzes white, because rook takes f6 is never working. We take with the queen, and they're not getting through on h7. The queen can no longer ever leave h3 because they lose the rook. So white's just kind of stuck here. They're almost playing without their queen and their rook. So black will win. All right, so we solved 10 problems, and I believe we got 8 of them right, 2 of them incorrect. A couple of them, the two that I got wrong, I thought were um, a little non-forcing. I think in both cases I saw the move that was the solution, but I just didn't think it worked out for some reason that the problem answer itself didn't address. There might be a way to add in an engine on here. I'm not sure, but if you have any feedback from those problems or want to tell me what the engine said, by all means, feel free to do so. And also, if you have any questions about just solving tactics in general, let me know in the comments. So hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll make another tactics training video again soon. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.